In this Baldur's Gate 3 video, we're going to be taking a look at the Fighter, Paladin, and Cleric classes, and this is the third video in a series where we take a look at a group of classes to help players narrow down which classes they want to play in Baldur's Gate 3. And you might be seeing this video going, why the heck are you comparing Fighter to Cleric? I don't think anyone is confused about whether they're playing a Fighter or Cleric. These are very different. And there are a couple reasons for this. First, I wanted to make a video comparing Paladin to Cleric. I feel like players coming from other RPGs might be trying to decide if they want to play one of these two classes. They have divine spellcasting, both of them, and there are similarities between these two classes. So there might be people out there wondering, which one of these do I play? And second, there's definitely going to be D&D fans out there that have narrowed down their choice to Fighter or Paladin. So I wanted to do a video about that as well. So it just seemed like consolidating those two separate videos into one video might be the easiest way to do it. And if you're someone who wanted to see a video comparing Fighter, Barbarian, Ranger, something like that, where, these are all martial classes that can melee in combat, don't worry, I still have a video planned to do that as well. There might be a little overlap with the Fighter from here, but we'll be looking at it in a different angle in that video, right? Comparing the things of Fighter to those in a different light. And I might make a video as well comparing Cleric to Druid, the two wisdom spellcasters in the game, because I know a lot of 5e players that need some freshening up or, are vaguely familiar with these from playing early access might want a direct comparison to these two classes as well. Okay, so looking at Cleric, Fighter, and Paladin during character creation, you're going to notice immediately that Clerics have less health, they don't have heavy armor proficiency, and they don't have martial weapon proficiency. Fighters and Paladins have all of these things. They have the same proficiencies. So coming down to proficiencies in health, Paladin and Fighters are exactly the same, Cleric being slightly behind them in terms of the amount of HP and proficiencies that they have. And this generally puts Clerics at a little bit of a disadvantage compared to these classes in martial combat because they don't have martial weapon proficiency. They're going to deal less damage in martial combat than these two other classes, unless they choose the War Domain as their subclass, which will give them heavy armor proficiency and martial weapon proficiency at level 1. So if you select this during character creation, you will actually be about on the same level of these, minus a little bit of health at the very beginning at level 1. When it comes to saving throw proficiencies, Clerics have Wisdom and Charisma just like Paladins, and Fighters have Strength and Constitution. Constitution is arguably the best overall proficiency to have for saving throws since a lot of spells target those, and Wisdom is also very, very good. So these kind of come out about the same, give or take. Each of these three classes gets to pick 2 skills, so they're not like a huge skill advantage. I will mention that Clerics can choose Persuasion, Fighters can choose Intimidation, and Paladins can choose Intimidation and Persuasion. This is not particularly important on Clerics and Fighters since they typically won't have a lot of Charisma, but Paladins use Charisma for their spellcasting modifier, so Intimidation and Persuasion is good to know because they can use them very effectively in dialogue scenarios. So if you want to play a character that is dialogue focused but also kind of a warrior in combat or a holy warrior, Paladin is a very good choice for that. Okay, those things being said, let's take a look at the Fighter first and sort of see what separates them from the other two classes, particularly Paladin. So Fighters at level 1 get to choose from one of 6 fighting styles, and what makes them different than the Paladin or Ranger, besides the fact that these two classes get to do this at the second level, is that Fighters have access to all 6 fighting styles, while Rangers have access to 4 of them, and Paladins have access to 4 other ones. There's some overlap between Ranger and Paladin here, but Fighters can choose from any of the 6 that they wish. And these fighting styles range from making them better at archery using bows, making them better at dual-wielding weapons, making them better at two-handed or sword and shield. And so you can kind of have a focus for your fighter starting at level 1. That doesn't mean this is the only way the fighter has to play, because they will more than likely still use a bow and some sort of setup for melee, but it will help kind of hone in on what you want your fighter to be really good at. And Fighters have a class feature at level 2 called Action Surge, which allows them to take an extra action in combat. And this is not a bonus action or anything like that. You just click it, you gain an extra action. And why this is particularly strong is for 2 reasons. First is that Fighters gain an extra attack at level 5, and they gain another extra attack at level 11. This means that when they use the attack action during their turn, they'll actually gain an extra attack once they're level 5. They'll be able to attack 2 times, but only if they use attack as an action. And then once they're level 11, they'll be able to attack 2 additional times if they use attack as an action. But when you use Action Surge, you're allowed to use attack again as an action, which then refreshes these bonus attacks. So at level 5, you would actually be able to attack 4 times in a turn after Action Surge, and at level 11, you'd be able to attack 6 times if you used Action Surge, which is a lot of damage to say the least. But this isn't the only reason that Action Surge is so good. A lot of classes will dip into Fighter a couple levels to pick this up, in order to be able to cast an additional spell in their turn, for instance. Take Sorcerer as an example. Sorcerers can use Quicken Spell Meta Magic, if you saw our Sorcerer Wizard Warlock video, to make a spell a bonus action. So they could theoretically cast 3 spells if they make a spell a bonus to action, cast a spell with their action, and then use Action Surge and cast another spell. That can be extremely deadly and setting up like a huge first turn of combat where you can really turn the tide of a deadly battle into something that's very, very manageable. And at level 3, fighters are going to pick a specialization. This is either going to be Battlemaster, Champion, or Eldritch Knight. And Battlemasters get better in combat by using something called Superiority Dice, which are kind of like a resource that fighters can use to improve the damage of their attacks, but also add additional effects, such as frightening targets, pushing them back, knocking them down, disarming them while they're doing this at the same time. So this allows them to be even more effective in combat through various effects like this. Champions, on the other hand, are improved in combat by having a higher critical range, meaning that instead of having to roll a 20 in order to critically strike, they can roll a 19 or 20 in critical strike to get critical strike damage. And then also at level 10, they're going to gain another fighting style. So you could specialize in one at level 1, and champions will be able to get another one at level 2. So maybe you took archery at level 1, but you also want to pick up like dual wielding or dual wielder or something like that at level 10 to be able to dual wield more effectively. Champions are also going to gain that benefit. And lastly, we come to Eldritch Knight, which is sort of a hybrid between a fighter and a wizard. It gives you access to some wizard spells, not a lot of them, but some of them, and allows you to cast spells and be a fighter in combat. So if you want to play like a hybrid type class, then this would be something that you would want to focus on. And the spell casting ability of the Eldritch Knight is intelligence. So just like wizards, you'd have to have some intelligence to, cast hostile spells very effectively. Otherwise, you can focus on self buffs or group buffs, and you don't have to worry too much about intelligence. And before we get into Paladin, one thing I really want to mention about the fighter is that they're very versatile in terms of ranged or melee combat. They can do either effectively, and they can either be a strength fighter and fight predominantly in melee range, or they can be a dexterity fighter and fight at range and also use finesse weapons in melee combat to do more damage, kind of dual wield or something like that. So the way you build your fighter is really up to you. You could go sword and shield, you could go two-handed and play like a strength fighter, or you could go like predominantly ranged to go something like dexterity and maybe dual wield also. They really have the flexibility to go either way, and you could build a dexterity or strength fighter easily. So moving along to Paladin, Paladins have more of a focus on spell casting than fighters do unless a fighter takes Eldritch Knight. Paladins are just going to cast more spells by nature because no matter what Paladin you're playing, you're going to gain spells. And they also have a little bit of healing built into them because of their class feature Lay On Hands, which allows them to heal another character for a little bit every so often. So at level 2, Paladins gain their fighting style, and they have a selection of 4 fighting styles available to them. They are missing notably archery and 2-weapon fighting. So they're not going to get better with their fighting style at, using a ranged weapon like a bow or crossbow, and they're not going to get better at using 2 weapons. So those 2 play styles are not something a Paladin is typically going to use. That doesn't mean you can't use them, but generally speaking, if you would like to use one of those 2 play styles, you would probably be better off going with a fighter or ranger. So this kind of narrows them down to like a sword and shield playstyle, or maybe like a single sword or a heavy weapon like a great sword style of play. That's typically what you're going to see Paladins using. And they also gain spell casting at level 2, Divine Spell Casting, which uses their Charisma modifier, as I mentioned earlier. So again, this goes really well with other classes, when we're talking about multi-classing, that use Charisma, like Bard, Warlock, Sorcerer. All these classes use Charisma, so they're not bad pairs to pair with a Paladin. And also, if you're wanting to play a character that's very good in dialogue, particularly with persuasion and intimidation, Paladin is not a bad choice because they're going to have high charisma and they have access to those skill proficiencies. Paladins also don't gain as many spells as Cleric does, and to give you some idea of a direct comparison, at level 5, Paladins will have 4 level 1 spells and 2 level 2 spells, where Clerics will have 4 level 1 spells, 3 level 2 spells, and 2 level 3 spells. So Paladins won't even have access to level 3 spells at the same level. So Clerics come out ahead in the spell casting department, although Paladins do have a decent amount of spells. And perhaps the thing that Paladin is really known for in BG3 and in D&D is its Divine Smite ability, which allows them to expend a spell slot to buff their next melee attack for substantial damage. And I mean, it's a lot of damage. And each level of spell slot that you expend increases the amount of damage that it does. So Paladins can not only cast spells with their spell slot, but they can also boost their melee damage significantly. So they have the option to do either one. And the thing here that I want to draw your attention to is that Divine Smite only works with melee weapon attacks. It does not work with ranged weapon attacks. So unlike some other games like Pillars of Eternity or something like that, where you could play a ranged Paladin, you're not really going to be playing a ranged Paladin in BG3, because you're going to want to take advantage of Divine Smite. It's one of the best ways to get damage on your Paladin, which means you need to be in melee range. And at level 3, Paladins are going to make a Sacred Oath, which is how they choose their subclass, and a few things are going to be determined by that Sacred Oath. And one of these things is the Channel Divinity abilities of the Paladin. Each Paladin has 2 different Channel Divinity abilities where they kind of channel the divinity that their oath is to and get some sort of effect. For instance, Oath of Devotion, they have Sacred Weapon, which buffs their weapon to deal increased damage. Or they have Turn the Unholy, which turns all the undead around them, driving them off so that they're not attacked by undead. And these are going to change from Paladin to Paladin depending on, what oath you take. The oath they choose is also going to determine some of the spells they get outside of their spell class, kind of like the way Warlock would. So if you want some different spells, you might choose an oath based on those spells. And to give you kind of a rough idea without going through all of these, Oath of Devotion gives you like buffs, protection, and mild healing type spells. Oath of the Ancients gives you like nature spells. Some of these spells are from the Druid list. And Oath of Vengeance gives you like a lot of control and utility spells. And lastly, the thing that your oath does is it determines the actions that you'll predominantly be taking in your playthrough. Paladins are bound by their oath, so the choices that you make in dialogue or the decisions you make throughout the game, if they go counter to that oath, will actually break that oath, and then you will technically become an Oathbreaker Paladin, which has its own, spells, it has its own Channel Divinity, etc., and its own class features. So if you take an oath, you're going to have to follow those or you're going to become an Oathbreaker. And then obviously, if you break any of those oaths, you'll be an Oathbreaker, and then you don't have to worry about the oaths anymore, and you can play a Paladin and have the abilities of the Oathbreaker. And one thing I want to mention or get into real quick before we get on to Cleric is that Paladins also gain extra attack at level 5. So at level 5, Fighters and Paladins both have extra attacks, so they deal about the same amount of damage in that regard. However, keep in mind that Fighters will gain a 3rd attack at level 11, although that's going to be quite a ways through the game, whereas Paladins can buff their damage with Divine Smite from level 2. So I think overall, Paladins are going to have a generally higher damage output than Fighters, but keep in mind that Fighters can use Action Surge to gain up to 4 attacks in one turn. So Fighters can have extremely high burst for one turn that will outperform a Paladin, but just generally over the course of a battle, a Paladin will probably outperform a Fighter until you get to that 3rd attack. And Paladins have more utility in the form of spells they can cast, healing, buffs, damage spells, etc. So there is that as well, but keep in mind this comes with the drawback that Paladins have to follow a specific code or they become an Oathbreaker and Fighters do not. So if you're a player who doesn't really know what you're going to do when you go through the game and you want to be completely free to do whatever you want in every scenario and you're not bound by a good or bad playthrough, then Fighter might be a better option than Paladin for you. So this takes us to Cleric, and as I mentioned before, Clerics are a little behind Paladin and Fighter with their proficiencies. They don't have heavy armor, they don't have martial weapons. So if you want to play like a martial Cleric, you definitely need to pick up some proficiency. You can do that from the War Domain, you can do that with specific weapons through races, or you can multi-class with another class and pick up some proficiencies if you want to do that, if you're just trying to build a martial Cleric. And Clerics are also divine spellcasters. They have more spells that they'll learn than Paladin. They can cast more spells than Paladin. They can cast higher level spells than Paladin. So generally speaking, they're just going to be a better all-around spellcaster. And their wisdom is their spellcasting ability modifier, unlike Paladins, which use charisma. So they're a little bit different in that regard. And also that makes them a little bit worse, in my opinion. Not even a little bit, significantly worse at dialogue checks, because you're not going to get the extra points from charisma into your dialogue. So Paladins are going to be much better in dialogue than Clerics. So if that's really important to you, that's one edge that Paladin has over Cleric. So during character creation, you're going to choose the domain of your Cleric, and this is going to influence the way your Cleric plays throughout the game, and it does that in a couple ways. First, it influences your Channel Divinity. Just like Paladins, Clerics gain Channel Divinity abilities, and what these are is dependent upon the domain that you choose. For instance, if you choose Life Domain, your Channel Divinity can be used to heal your group. Or if you choose the War Domain, your Channel Divinity can be used to improve your attack roll. Your domain is also going to influence the spells that you gain outside of the Cleric spell list, and it's also going to influence the ones that you will always know that you haven't prepared. Just like Wizards, Clerics need to prepare their spells from their spell list in order to use these in combat. they can know a lot more spells than what they have prepared, so you're going to have to select the ones that you want. And depending on the domain that you pick, certain spells will always be prepared for you outside of the other ones. So for instance, if you choose like Life Domain, the Bless and Cure Wounds spells will always be prepared for you on top of whatever other spells you can prepare. They don't take up prepared spell slots. You will always be able to cast those spells, prepared or not. And if you choose Light Domain, you'll always be able to cast Fairy Fire or Burning Hands, whether you have them prepared or not. Those are just a couple examples, but you get the idea. And your domain is also going to influence some of the class features that you gain for that specific domain as a cleric. So your domain is going to influence the Channel Divinity ability or abilities that you have. Those are going to be different from domain to domain. The spells that you gain and also the ones that are always prepared for you are going to change depending on the domain. And then you're also going to have unique class features. I'm not going to get into all of these domains in this video because there are 7, and also because we haven't seen all of them to know exactly if they follow the handbook or not, but I will get into a few of them to give you an idea. So the Light Domain specializes in fire, effectively. They're going to gain a lot of fire spells. So if you want to be like a fire-focused cleric, then the Light Domain is a good choice for you. Their Channel Divinity ability deals AoE damage, deals radiant damage, and an AoE around them, so that increases the amount of damage they can do because of that ability. And at level 8, you're going to be able to add your Wisdom modifier to the damage of any cleric cantrip that you use, and cantrips are level 0 spells that can be used once every turn. So this is really, really strong, right? So if you use something like Sacred Flame, you're going to be able to boost the damage of it a lot, making it a lot closer to like a regular weapon attack in terms of damage. They also gain a lot of fire spells. As I mentioned, they gain Burning Hands, they gain Flaming Spear and Scorching Ray. They also gain Fireball. So again, if you want to focus on fire, light would be the choice for you. And if you choose the Life Domain, your heals are going to be stronger. Each healing spell you cast will be stronger than other domains. Your Channel Divinity is an AoE heal, as I mentioned before. At level 6, when you cast a heal on another target, you'll actually heal yourself as well, but for a lot less healing. And at level 8, you'll actually increase the damage that you deal with weapon attacks once per turn by a bit of damage, so that will improve the damage you deal as well. And this isn't melee weapon attacks either, this is any weapon attack, so this could be a bow or, some other ranged weapon if you want. And the last domain I want to talk about here is the War Domain. This is in the full version of the game. I got to see it a little bit when I was playing with Larry, and I messed around with it a little bit, but I don't remember all the nitty-gritty details, and I wasn't, level 12, so I didn't get to see like all the passives that you gain. So I'm going to use the book as a reference here, but assuming it's similar or same to the book, the reason I want to talk a bit about War Domain is it sort of brings the cleric closer to the fighter and paladin in terms of their martial prowess. So you might be wondering, well, can I play a cleric and get closer to that even if it's not as good? And that's why I want to talk a little bit about this one. So as I mentioned earlier, when you take War Domain at level 1, you gain martial weapon proficiency and heavy armor proficiency. So this puts them up with Paladin and Fighter in terms of proficiencies instantly. And they also have another class feature at level 1 called War Priest, which makes it so that when they use their attack action in combat, they can use their bonus action to make another weapon attack. So this gives them actually 2 attacks at level 1 compared to Fighter and Paladin that have 1. So they're actually better than Fighter than Paladin in terms of what they can do in combat at level 1. And War Domain clerics can use this ability up to their Wisdom ability modifier number of times before they long rest, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember exactly how many there were, but I think that's right. The reason that's important is that because fighters at level 2 will gain Action Surge that they can replenish on short rest, and at level 2 paladins will also gain Divine Smite, which they'll be able to use 2 times. So at level 2, it sort of evens out. So these War Domain clerics will be ahead at level 1, which lasts for like 20 or 30 minutes of the game. And then they'll be about on par with paladins and fighters for, the level 2 part of the game. But the thing is that Paladin will start to pull ahead here as they gain more spell slots, allowing them to use Divine Smite more often. And fighters will stay about on the same as the War Domain clerics until they hit level 5, where they gain extra attack. Paladins will also gain extra attack at level 5. So they're both going to become incredibly stronger with their martial capabilities at level 5, whereas Cleric doesn't gain that extra attack at level 5, even if they're War Domain. So War Domain Clerics are going to be close to Fighters and Paladins early on in the game, but they're going to fall further and further behind as the game goes on. And their Channel Divinity will allow them to connect more in combat by giving them a bonus to their attack roll, and also at level 8 they'll gain Divine Strike, which will increase the damage that they do in combat with a weapon. Again, not a melee weapon, any weapon. And this is really one of the best strengths of Cleric, in my opinion, is that they have more flexibility in what they can do. They could be a melee Cleric and use touch range spells. They could be a ranged Cleric and use ranged spells. They could be a ranged Cleric and use buff spells. Whereas a Paladin's pretty much going to be a melee fighter that goes into combat and, uses their spells probably outside of combat most of the time, or uses their spell slots for Divine Smite. Because keep in mind with a Paladin that they gain an extra attack at level 5 if they use their action for an attack. But if they cast a spell with their action, they don't gain an extra attack. So they'll probably use their, healing spells and buffing spells or whatever outside of combat, and then use those spell slots for Divine Smite inside of combat. And I think that separates Cleric a lot here, is they can play at range. They can make a bow using Cleric, play Dexterity, Wisdom, stay back, range things down, cast spells, or they can go sword and board, go in and attack in melee combat and use touch range spells. So before we wrap up this video, we'll talk a little bit about multi-classing, and I've mentioned some things before, but Paladin's predominantly going to be multi-classed with other classes that are charisma-based. This is Bard, Warlock, Sorcerer. Any of those 3 classes is going to go really well with Paladin. Talk a little bit about Fighter. You might multi-class Fighter with Rogue for the same reason, to gain an extra bonus attack, particularly if you're like a dual-wield fighter, so you can gain attack with main hand, attack with offhand with your bonus action, attack with main hand with your extra attack, attack with offhand with your second bonus action. That might be a good way to make like a dual-wield fighter. You can multi-class with Wizard or Sorcerer to pick up some spell casting. A lot of time, like Wizards or Sorcerers like to take a couple levels of Fighter to gain Action Surge, or maybe 3 levels to pick up Eldritch Knight if you're a Wizard. So that's also an option with Fighter. And a lot of people like to multi-class with Fighter as well, just to pick up some proficiencies. So if you need some proficiencies, dipping 1 level into Fighter is not bad. And keep in mind, you gain a fighting style at level 1, so that's also a huge buff to something like maybe like a Rogue that might want to pick up like Archery or something like that. And Cleric, when it comes to multi-classing, has like a broad spectrum of classes it can multi-class with. And even though it's Wisdom, you might, multi-class it with Ranger. Is not a bad option. You might multi-class it with Wizard in order to, pick up some spell lists. A lot of Wizards will take like a level or 2 in Cleric to pick up some spell lists. And also keep in mind that like you could multi-class it with Fighter to pick up extra attack. Maybe take like 5 levels of Fighter to get extra attack, especially if you took War Domain, which would then allow you to use your attack action and then get an extra attack at level 5 of Fighter, and then also use your bonus action for an attack. So, and then you could Action Surge. There's a lot of good combinations with Cleric. Usually you're going to be mixing to pick up some martial capabilities to give you something to do when you're not spellcasting. So that wraps up our video on Fighter, Paladin, Cleric. I hope it made sense why I put these 3 in a video. It would have been 2 videos that I just kind of was trying to make into one for the sake of time. I do plan to do like a Fighter, Barbarian, Ranger video, I think, to compare those 3 classes. And I do think I'm probably going to do a Druid, Cleric comparison, and probably also like a Bard, Warlock comparison, trying to get all these things done before we get to the launch of the game. So we'll see how much time we have. But if you guys have suggestions, if you have feedback, please let me know in the comments below.